This morning we're going to be taking a look at an Old Testament story, and we're going to look at the story, and then we're going to see why it matters to us. And we know, of course, that the Old Testament is there for our learning, and that's exactly what we're going to use it for this morning. And the basic lesson, just before we even get started, is to say that God is speaking if we are listening. We're going to take a look at Elijah's story here. Again, we're going to start in chapter 16. Because his story, Elijah's story here, ties very much into the story of another man by the name of Ahab. And Ahab, in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 30, it says of him, "Now Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him." That's a nice legacy for Ahab to have. He is the worst of the kings of Israel, and there were some pretty terrible kings of Israel. But he outranks all of them as being the most wicked. And of course, Ahab by himself is wicked, but he is not alone in his wickedness, because as we're probably aware, he marries a woman by the name of Jezebel. If you read the next verse there, verse 31, it says that it came to pass, as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he took Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. So it's bad enough that Ahab is just a bad king and a bad guy, but beyond that, he takes as his wife the daughter of a foreign king. And not only that, but someone who is a worshiper, of course, of false gods. Specifically Baal, although she would have worshipped other gods besides just Baal, but Baal's the primary god of the Sidonians. And so in verse 32, the result is that he, that is Ahab, set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, which he built in Samaria. So he built an altar for a foreign god and built a temple for a foreign god in a city in Israel. Well, that's not the greatest thing to do. Of course, Samaria at this time is the functional capital of Israel. It's not Jerusalem, because that's the capital of Judah. So he builds this in the heart of his very country. And he says, this is our God now. And so he's going to replace God as the true God with Baal. Largely because of his queen, his wife here. Of course, his wife does other terrible things as well. If you go over chapter 18, verse 4, Chapter 18, verse 4, it says, "For so it was, while Jezebel massacred the prophets of the Lord, that Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hid them in a cave, and some more in a cave, gave them bread and water. So some of them have been spared, but by and large, Jezebel has killed the prophets of God." Well, that's pretty bad. And I know it's kind of hard for us to relate to, but I guess the closest thing would be if the First Lady today went on a killing spree of preachers. That would be pretty rough, because it would be a state-sponsored execution of all of these people that we think are innocent, of course, and don't deserve this, and would strike fear into our hearts, I imagine. But that's the case here. The queen is the one doing the killing. But we also have, of course, our character in this story as well, of Elijah. And he's introduced for the first time in the Old Testament in chapter 17, verse 1. And it simply says, "And Elijah the Tishbite of the inhabitants of Gilead said to Ahab." So the first thing that we see him doing is speaking on behalf of God, because that's what prophets do. And he says, "As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be no dew nor rain these years, except at my word." So Elijah is sent to warn Ahab, because of the evil things that Ahab is doing, that there will be a drought in the land of Israel, and that has been appointed by God. And he is functioning as a prophet here, but it also is a show of God's authority. Ahab thinks that he has some authority, but God is the one that controls even the rain. So with Elijah here, though, he is the prophet of God this time. He's not the only prophet, but he is the primary prophet that God is using to accomplish his purposes. So one other thing with Elijah, and we'll tie this back in later on in the lesson, but Elijah's name, of course, is transliterated. If you were here last week and all, we talked a lot about transliteration, but his name is transliterated. It's a compound name. The first part is El, as in E-L, which is short for Elohim. It means God in a general sense, and the end of the name is Yah, which is short for Yahweh. So Elijah means God is Yahweh, or even better, the translation is Yahweh is God. As in, the God of the Hebrews, that is God. It's the only God. So that's what his name Elijah means. Of course, if you translate that into Greek or transliterate it into Greek, it's the name Elias with the same meaning. But this name is applicable. The name Yahweh is God is applicable to the story. And so we're going to see that later on, that Yahweh is God is exactly what's going to happen. So in chapter 18, a lot of the chapter actually deals with what's sometimes called the duel at Carmel. It's a story that we're hopefully all very familiar with, but the story goes that Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal to a competition of sorts, but not for themselves, but for their gods. So obviously Elijah on his side has the God of the universe, the creator, and on their side they have Baal, which is nothing. It's some carved stones, it's a few pillars that have been set up, but that's it. That's all Baal really is. So whenever the competition happens, of course, Baal cannot be reached because he does not exist. And God is able to rain fire down on the altar that Elijah has built. And everyone's impressed, rightfully so. In fact, so impressed that they will praise God as a result of this. And then the final result of this competition comes in verse 40, where it says, "And Elijah said to them, 'Seize the prophets of Baal, do not let one of them escape.' So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and executed them there." So they lose the competition of sorts, but they also lose their lives. And it's a rightful execution for these false teachers, false priests of a false god. But, as you can imagine, that doesn't make the king and queen of Israel very happy, since Baal is their adopted god. And so when we get down to chapter 19, starting verse 1, we're going to see the response here. 19 verse 1, it says, "And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. And then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, 'So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time.'" It's kind of a weird way to phrase a threat, but it is a threat. And it's a threat to Elijah's life. She wants him dead. Fueled by hatred, of course, but also from her perspective, I'm not trying to defend Jezebel here, but from her perspective, he has killed the prophets of her God, which would probably be pretty upsetting. It would be like someone killing your preacher, which hopefully would upset you at least a little bit. But the prophets have been killed. She's mad. She's wanting Elijah dead. So what does he do? Well, naturally, in verse 3 it says, "When he saw that, he arose and he ran for his life. And he went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there." So he actually flees from the country into the separate nation, currently separate, of Judah. In verse 4 it says, "He went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he prayed that he might die, and said, 'It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I'm no better than my fathers, for I'm no better off than they are.'" So the response here seems natural enough for Elijah to run, but I will try to clarify to say that it's not like Jonah. We know Jonah, another prophet of God, who ran from what God had commanded him to do. That's not really the case with Elijah here. Elijah isn't running from what God commanded, he's running from someone trying to kill him. That never even happened to Jonah. But in fact, we're going to see that he will be ministered to by an angel here in just a second, which, if anything, shows a little bit of approval from God, it would seem. But Elijah, fearing for his life, flees, and by this point he is, of course, exhausted, a little bit desperate, and terrified. So that's where we find him when we start to look into chapter 19 just a little bit. If you look down in verse 5, it says, "As he lay and slept under a broom tree, suddenly an angel touched him and said, 'Arise and eat.'" And the message from the angel is, you need your strength. Why? Because you've got a journey to make. Well, where are you going? Well, he's going to a place called Mount Horeb. Well, that doesn't sound very familiar, does it? Except that the other name for Mount Horeb that we know it by is Mount Sinai. So something very special is about to happen to Elijah, And it's going to happen at a very special place for the entire Jewish religion, which is Mount Sinai, the place where the Ten Commandments were delivered to Moses. So he flees away initially, but now he's going all the way to Mount Sinai. Verse 7 says that the angel of the Lord came back a second time, touched him, and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." So again, you need your strength, but it says the angel of the Lord. Probably sometime in the nearish future, we'll have a lesson just on the angel of the Lord, see if we can make any sense of it. But there seems to be something special about the angel of the Lord. It's more than just a messenger. Instead, it seems to be probably divine. Some people suggest it's Jesus before he comes to earth. I don't know if that's the case. Again, we'll probably have a lesson on it sometime. But this very special messenger of God comes to Elijah to tell him to go to a place that is special so something special can happen. So there is a lot of peculiar events taking place here. In verse 9, or at the end of verse 9, it says that God asked a question of Elijah. And the question is very simple. He says, "What are you doing here? Why are you here?" As in, why have you fled away from the people that are trying to kill you? And Elijah is going to immediately come with his answer and say, well, this is exactly why I'm here. You ask, here it is. He says, verse 10, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They've torn down your altars, and they've killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." Now, from Elijah's perspective, that's all true. And as far as he knows, that's true. God will correct him in just a minute, tell him that he's not alone entirely. But for right now, that is Elijah's situation. And so he says, from my point of view, I'm better off dead, as he said back just a few verses ago in verse 4. So the question is going to be asked here, but the question is going to be asked again with a little bit more answer given to it. But in between the two askings of the question by God to Elijah, something's going to happen. Again, this special event's going to take place. In verse 11, it says, "Then he said, 'Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord.' And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountain and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind was an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire." So where is the Lord? The Lord, it says, is in a still, small voice. If you're reading from the New King James, at least. It's translated different ways because the wording there is kind of challenging, like we talked about with transliteration. Sometimes it's a little difficult to translate. Sometimes it's translated as a soft or a low or a gentle whisper. Or sometimes even it's translated in other versions of the Bible, it's translated as a whistling of a gentle breeze. So take it how you will, but I think we can get some idea of what this means. There's a strong storm that comes initially, and then there's an earthquake, and then there's a fire, and then it's quiet. And then a breeze comes by, and God is in the breeze. And it's amazing to me that Elijah knows immediately. He knows he wasn't in the fire, the earthquake, or the storm, but instead when this still small voice comes, at that sound, Elijah knows immediately. And he puts something over his face and goes out to meet God. Because he knows that God is there. We'll talk about this, of course, a little bit more in just a minute. But the same question is asked. So at the end of verse 13, same question, a voice comes to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Same answer in verse 14. "I've been very zealous. The people are terrible, and they've killed the prophets, and I'm the only one left." That's my answer. So what does God say? God is going to respond here in the next couple verses. Verse 15, it says, "And the Lord said to him, 'Go and return your way to the wilderness of Damascus,'" as in go back to Israel. And he says, "And when you arrive, anoint Hazael king over Syria." So actually going past Israel now all the way to Syria, Damascus being the capital thereof at this time. So anoint Hazael as the new king of Syria, and also anoint Jehu as the son of Nimshi as king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place. So God says, okay, I hear what you're saying, but I still need you to do something. I know you're having a rough time with it, but I need you to do three things. Anoint a new king of Syria, a new king of Israel, and a new prophet. Beyond this, it says, it will be, in verse 17, it will be that whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill, and whoever escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill. God says to Elijah, I know you're having a rough time, but guess what? It's going to end. He says, once you anoint these three people to do this, they are going to restore Israel to what it's supposed to be. Between the king of Syria, the king of Israel, and this new prophet, they're going to take care of the problem that you have right now. And that's true. We're going to see that happen if we keep reading. But in verse 18, it says, Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knee have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. God says there's a remnant. He says there's a group left. There's just a few people, and they are actually following me. There's not many, but there's a few. In fact, if you want to get more technical here, there's probably over 1 million people living in Israel at this time. So 7,000 doesn't sound too great. But that does mean that Elijah is not the only one left. That's the story. That's the story for this morning. It is not just a story, of course. It's an accurate historical account of what took place thousands of years ago. But what can we learn from it thousands of years later? A few things. Once I go through all that. Okay. First thing is this. God knows who is faithful. A lot of our time seems to be spent with worrying about the future of our country, about worrying about the current state even of our country, and saying, well, there's a lot of people that are unfaithful. That's true. But at the same time, God knows who is faithful. God knows that even if your society is in opposition to Him, even if you live somewhere that's in rebellion against God all the time, God still counts you as faithful. He's not going to judge you based on where you live, but instead He's going to judge you based on you, or even better, based on His Son that He can see in you. So God knows who is faithful. Now, that being said, your nation, whatever nation you live in, you may still get punished. Certainly Israel would be punished because of the mostly sinful group of people that lived there. And you might have to suffer some punishment because you lived there. But God knows if you are faithful, even when everyone around you is not. Second thing that we can learn here is that God's plans are bigger than ours. And actually, if I can put a number on it, God's plans are 7,000% bigger than we know about. How do I know that? Because Elijah said, I alone am left. And God says, you are wrong 7,000 times over. And I think that's probably a pretty good illustration of how much we know versus how much God knows about our situation. We say, okay, I can see everything around me. I can see that the prophets have been killed, and I'm next. I can see that the people are unfaithful. But God says, I've got a bigger plan than that. I was thinking about this morning, actually. I was looking over this lesson. It would be nice if I could see God's plan as a whole. It would be nice if I knew exactly what was going to take place. It would be nice if I knew everything. But I don't. But I was thinking of a question. If I had the option, if I could see everything that was going to happen, if I could know everything that was planned out, would that be better than if God knows it? I could see it, but I can't do anything about it. Isn't it still better if God knows the whole plan and can actually make differences in it? It would be nice for me to be able to see it, but it's much, much better. It's preferable that God is the one that can see it, even if I can't see the whole picture. Third lesson is to be still and know that he is God. Psalm 46, verse 10. Be still and know. That's probably one of the most neglected verses in the Bible, at least nowadays. Maybe that's an overstatement, but how often are we still? Life is loud. Life is busy all the time. The bulletin article's about that today, actually. But life it's loud. And if you don't stop, if you don't be still and quiet for just a minute, it's very easy to miss out on what God has to say. In our story, of course, God comes as a breeze. Again, how long has it been since you just sat somewhere and listened to the breeze? Because biblically speaking, God may not say any words to you if you just sit there and listen to the breeze. But if you stay long enough, you'll hear him. But how often does that happen? Instead, how often are we sitting in the car waiting to go somewhere? How often are we busy with everyday life and we never stop to listen to what God has to say on the breeze or in his word? Another lesson right along with this is to listen for God. Listen for God. Two ways this applies with Elijah. The first way is this. God asked the question twice. He says, "Why are you here, Elijah?" And Elijah says, let me tell you about it. Let me tell you everything that's going wrong in my life, God, since you asked. What if instead, and maybe this isn't fair, but in my life or with Elijah, what if instead I said, when God asked the question, "Why are you here?" And I say, "God, I don't know. You tell me." Because if Elijah had answered that way the first time, if he said, "It doesn't matter how I am, God, you tell me what you need to tell me," then he would have instantly known that his troubles were over once he anointed these 3 people and that there were 7,000 others that were on his side. Because God wanted to tell him that the first time, but Elijah wouldn't listen. Instead, he said, "Well, God, these are my problems." But how often is that us? Where God says, "Well, how are you doing?" And we say, "Oh, let me tell you everything that's wrong in my life. This person's really bothering me. I'm going to pray that this thing changes because of how much I dislike it." When instead, if I said, "Well, God, it doesn't matter too much. Just tell me what you need me to know," might make some difference. But the other way this applies with listening for God, Elijah saw God when big things happen. Or I guess you could say it when loud things happen. Whenever God announced that there would be a drought, you think Elijah was pretty confident in his God at that point? I think so. It's a total display of authority over the king of Israel. And Elijah can say, "Yeah, that's my God. That's right. He's got this." Or whenever he's at Mount Carmel and God says, "Okay, I'll show you how powerful I am. I'll show you exactly how I match up against Baal." At that point, it's pretty easy for Elijah to say, "Yes, that is my God." But he was only looking for the big things. I think that's kind of the point of this display that God has on Mount Sinai for Elijah. Because God comes in a storm. It's powerful. It's a display of God's might. And he comes in an earthquake. Powerful, impressive. And he comes in a fire. And again you say, "Wow, God is in total control because I can see his power." None of that matters. It doesn't matter if there's a fire, storm, or earthquake. It doesn't matter if there's a great display of power at Mount Carmel or a drought. Instead, it's none of those things. But it's that God speaks softly sometimes too. Probably more often than he speaks loudly. I think the same thing's true in my life. If God does something big in my life, I say, "Yep, that's right. Okay, this is good. God did that." But when God speaks every day, real gently, real softly, I miss that more often than not. Last lesson is this. Chapter 18, verse 39, is still in Mount Carmel, still in that, after that battle's taken place. Verse 39, it says, "Now when all the people saw it," as in that fire being rained down, consuming everything, "when the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, 'The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God.'" If you take that literally from Hebrew, what does it say? it says Yahweh is El. What does that mean again? It's that same name of Elijah. Whenever God displays his power, the people say Elijah. They say God is Yahweh. Yahweh is God. Yahweh is God when everything's going well and when he's showing his power and his might in your life. And God is still God when he's just a quiet, gentle breeze that blows by. But life gets loud and life gets busy, and sometimes we don't always recognize the quiet times that God is still God. This morning, God is still God today. Yahweh is still God even today. And this morning, if you're not a child of his, then you can't experience either the impressive feats that he does or even the quiet, gentle whisper that comes to you from him either. This morning, become a child of God. This morning, if you need to repent of sin that's in your life, this is the time. This is the opportunity to make the change. If there's anything we can do for you, I see you come forward now as we stand, as we sing.